So we're going to start talking about different environments on the planet in terms of biological communities and ultimately these areas that we refer to as biomes. Generally speaking, especially in the land, we can think of the climate as being the main driver of variation in the habitats and the kinds of biological communities we're going to see in different parts of the planet. And so we can think of areas that are colder versus warmer, and then areas that are drier versus wetter. And of course, we can imagine any combination of these two. We can imagine areas that are cold and dry, areas that are warm and dry, areas like Hilo that are warm and wet. And this gives us a sort of a first glance at the kind of variation that we have on this planet. Another way we can think about it, and now thinking very specifically about the kinds of communities we can expect with respect to temperature, is what we call life zones. And so you can imagine, first of all, we might go from somewhere, if we're somewhere near the equator, like let's say in India, we might have tropical rainforest down near sea level. And as we go to higher and higher elevation, we're going to go through different kinds of forests, different kinds of environments, all the way up to the Himalaya, where we're going to have ice and snow. So as we go along the way, we have these zones of life. And of course, this is something we have on the big island of Hawaii, depending on where we go and whether we're on the slopes of one of the higher mountains. We can also think about these life zones adding a little bit more complexity, thinking about rainfall and what the moisture situation is. So we call these humidity provinces, right? And so you can have areas that are warm and wet. We can have areas that are warm and dry. And then we can have areas that are cold and wet and cold and dry, right? And so this is, again, a way of framing it. But of course, now we have some numbers. This is getting to the ideas that we can measure and say, well, how much rainfall does it take to be a rainforest? And how cold do you have to get before you have what you would consider to be an alpine or a tundra or polar environment? These are the kind of ideas that again, von Humboldt had kind of started out thinking. And this is just one of many ways that people characterize these environments with respect to physical aspects of the climate. So generally speaking, biomes are major types of communities. And when we're talking about land in particular, biomes we can think of as having characteristic vegetation, different kinds of plant communities, and then obviously the animals that are living there that occur in different areas of the planet, largely as a function of climate. And so you can imagine areas that are rainforest, areas that are desert, areas that are tundra, which is to say areas that are too cold for trees. And each of these really is relating very closely to the climate that is in those regions. We'll go ahead and talk about those when we get into our main section of terrestrial biomes. Before that, I want to talk a little bit about the ocean, because the ocean also has biomes, although they're organized differently than they are on land. The first thing about the ocean, of course, is that it is, we have areas that are deeper and shallower, but because of that, and because we have life all through different depths of the ocean, it really is a three-dimensional environment. And so right away, we need to make a distinction between the areas that are near the surface and the areas that are really deep. As we go from the surface to deeper water, again, depending on where we are on the surface of the planet, whether we're up near the poles or down near the equator, certainly we're going to see a change in temperature. If we're near the equator or in most latitudes, basically we're going to have warmer water near the surface where it's being warmed by the sun, and it's going to get gradually colder as we get deeper. Once we're in the deepest water, however, and we can see that in this graph, the water temperature is going to be just barely above freezing. Even if we're at the North Pole, this is going to be true. So in other words, we have the frozen ice cap where the water is colder than freezing at the surface, if we're, let's say, at the North Pole. As we go down in depth, that water is going to be just above freezing, even if we go all the way down to the bottom. So whereas the surface really varies in temperature, if we're in the deepest water, it's just as cold no matter where we go in the deepest parts of the ocean floor. The other thing is, of course, that the light situation is basically eternally dark when we're in depths that are very, very deep. And we don't have to get really deep before we get to that area where there really is no light at all. Once we start getting to be several hundred or 1,000 meters deep, we really stop seeing much sunlight and we have an eternally dark situation. We also have some differences in terms of the kinds of gases that we see. And so right near the surface, interestingly, we have more oxygen and less carbon dioxide. And that's because of the activity of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is doing photosynthesis. It's drawing in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. And so that means right near the surface, this is going to be the part of the ocean where we have the most oxygen. Not surprisingly, this means that fish and other marine organisms that depend on getting their oxygen from the water are going to be most plentiful in this region, even when we take into account the fact that this is where the warmest temperatures are. So there are a lot of differences when we go from shallow water to deep water. So the first biome, in a sense, that we'll talk about in the ocean is what we call the pelagic zone. And the pelagic zone essentially is the open ocean. These are the areas away from land where the water is relatively deep, but in these cases, we're talking about the water that's near the surface. So in a sense, this is water that is near the surface and basically the air above it. So that's the whole biome itself. It includes seabirds, for example, because of course, the basis of the food web is still happening in the ocean. The phytoplankton, the organisms that are eating the phytoplankton, etc. And so this is happening in deep water. We're not thinking about what's happening at the bottom of the ocean. We'll get to those biomes that are in shallower water a little closer, but in deep water, when we're in, or in deeper parts of the ocean, when we're in talking about the water that's near the top, this is the pelagic zone. And depending on where we are, now it really matters what the temperature is. Because it turns out that the coldest parts of the ocean, not quite all the way up in the Arctic, but areas that are in, let's say, the middle latitudes to somewhat high latitudes, all the way up to places like Alaska, these are going to have colder water. Colder water holds more dissolved gases, more oxygen, more carbon dioxide. And so that's going to allow more photosynthesis. It's going to allow a more well-supplied food web. And so we're going to just generally have a greater density of life in these areas when we're in the open ocean. Okay. And so, ironically, in the tropics, and if we go to the waters around Hawaii, you can see, and these are measurements of the amount of photosynthesis that's occurring. Photosynthesis is measured in grams of carbon per meter square per year. You can see that we have more than 4 times as much photosynthesis happening in open water from phytoplankton up near Alaska than we do compared with a place like Hawaii. And so the open ocean in tropical areas like Hawaii is, in a sense, you can think of as a desert. There's not a lot of algae in that water. The water is very clear, of course. You go up to Alaska, the water is very murky. It's green. It looks like tea because there's so much phytoplankton. And again, that's helping to feed the food web even out in the open ocean. Of course, part of what's going on also is ocean currents. And so oftentimes, because we have these circulations of ocean water that is clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere, oftentimes we're going to have colder water moving down the west coast of major continents. And again, it's going to be a mirror image in the southern hemisphere from what we're seeing here in the North Atlantic. And that means that places like California, places like the western coast of Europe and North Africa are going to have colder water and consequently higher primary productivity, more photosynthesis from the phytoplankton. And again, just to sort of zoom in on that map, you can see these areas like the Gulf of Alaska in particular have huge amounts of primary productivity in the open ocean compared with these areas near Hawaii. And this has really profound implications for the fishery, where most of the life is going to be, etc. Now, when we're in the open ocean and we're in deep water, we have a radically different situation. Generally speaking, these are places that are dependent on food that is sinking from above. And so generally, a lot of these areas really are mostly made up of scavengers and organisms that are consuming basically whatever is left over from whatever organisms are sinking to the bottom. However, we do in some of these deep areas also have these hydrothermal vents. These are areas of deep volcanic activity that are releasing warm gases and any number of things that basically set up the basis of a food chain. There are organisms that are consuming these gases and actually able to not do photosynthesis, but chemosynthesis, and be able to derive energy directly from this warm volcanic water. And that sets up a very different food web. And again, these areas are sort of isolated in pockets, and we're going to have a whole bunch of very strange organisms living in these kinds of places. So this is the bottom, the so-called abyssal zone, which consists of, again, a lot of organisms that are really, in a sense, decomposers, or things that are feeding on decaying and dead organisms, but also these very localized hydrothermal events, which are really rich centers of activity very, very far down where there's no sunlight and where otherwise you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of life. When we're in shallower water, now lots of things become possible. And so let's start with the tropics, where if we have shallow enough water, we can have basically a substrate, something for coral reefs to anchor to. And coral reefs, unlike other tropical, let's say pelagic areas, open water, actually can do lots of photosynthesis. They consist of a symbiotic relationship between the coral organism itself, which is actually an animal that builds this shell and ultimately forms these colonies to build this structure, and these algae that are living in symbiosis with the coral animal to do photosynthesis. The coral animal delivers nutrients and then carbon dioxide directly to the algae, and so they can actually do quite a bit of photosynthesis. And this makes for the basis of a very complex food web with lots of biodiversity. Interestingly, if we're in the tropics, we have huge amounts of life near these shallow water, these coral reefs, and very little life when we get out into the open ocean. And of course, these are famous in the oceans, in particular, for being the most biodiverse biome in the ocean. And again, we find these in areas with warm water in the tropics and where the water is relatively shallow. We also don't find them particularly close to land because that's a source of fresh water, which prohibits the growth of coral reefs, and also sediment and silt, which can create cloudy environments that aren't good for coral reefs, which require large amounts of light in order to do their photosynthesis. We also have a temperate biome in shallow water in areas with cooler currents, so the west coast of some of these continents and areas at somewhat higher latitudes. And these are kelp forests. Kelp is essentially a number of species of what we call macroalgae. These are large plant-like organisms, although they're not directly related to the plants that grow on land. And what they'll do is they'll be anchored to the bottom, and they will basically be floating or sort of extending towards the surface to make these forest-like structures, these habitats. And these are very rich because, again, they're in cold water. There's lots of photosynthesis going on, in fact, huge amounts of photosynthesis that are comparable to the forests we might find on land. And you can see this water is relatively murky because there's also phytoplankton in these areas. Together, this makes for a very rich ecosystem with lots of productivity. They're not as biodiverse as the coral reef biome. However, they do support large numbers of fish and a very complex food web that will go all the way up to seals and sea lions and even great white sharks. And so the sheer amount of life, and in this case I mean animal life, is actually very high. And so of course these are also areas that are very productive fisheries.